Hey everyone, this is Pete, and welcome back to Atari ST A to Z, a series of short playthroughs of Atari ST games, some which I grew up with and some which are new to me. Today is one of the former. Today we're taking a look at Afterburner, which is a 1988 release from Activision, licensed from Sega and developed by Argonaut Software of Starglider and Star Fox fame. It was a conversion of a popular arcade machine at the time, as most people probably know at this point. And at the time this was released in 1988, everyone pretty much knew there was no way that the home systems of the period would be able to produce a truly accurate recreation of a superscaler game from the arcades. And some publications at the time were a little bit cynical about this. The One magazine, in its review of Afterburner for Atari ST, for example, commented that, I quote, "Coin-ups have become increasingly sophisticated in recent years, but sadly the software is now second place to the hardware. The humble coin-up has almost become a fairground ride, albeit at the expense of the once all-important gameplay, which has now taken a backseat to elaborate dedicated cabinets." Now, if you're not familiar, one of the most memorable versions of Afterburner in the arcades was a sit-down hydraulic cabinet that would sort of pitch and roll as you moved the joystick around and did things on the screen. It would shake you around and that sort of thing. And that later developed in its follow-up called G-Lock into a variant called R360, which would actually go through a full 360 degrees of motion in every direction. So it would actually roll all the way around. You could loop the loop in it, and it was £3 a go for 2 minutes of gameplay. So it really was a fairground ride. Anyway, I continue with what the One magazine had to say. Sure, Argonaut has managed to capture the features and what little gameplay there was in the original, but gone is the thrill of being thrown around in a hydraulic cabinet, gone are the breathtaking and exhilarating 3D graphics, and gone is the incentive to play. Now, I would kind of debate that last bit, because particularly in the UK, I've talked a little bit about this before, but particularly in the UK, arcades have always been very much something that only really cropped up at the seaside. And if you live somewhere that is landlocked, like I did, I lived sort of right in the middle of East Anglia near Cambridge at the time. Yeah, your only opportunity to play arcade machines would be when you went on holiday to the seaside. And so the only chance I got to play Afterburner would be when we'd take a day trip over to somewhere like Hunstanton or Felixstowe, or when we'd have a family holiday down to Cornwall or Devon, and we'd drop in at Newquay, which always had really good arcades. And so home conversions of these arcade games were really valuable to people like me, because it was the only opportunity we had to experience some of these games. And yes, we were well aware, painfully aware in many situations, that they were vastly inferior to the original arcade versions of these games, but they were all we had, so we sort of put up with it, really. Now, I've still got my copy of Afterburner back in the day, and unlike many of the other ST games that you can see behind me there, this is one that I actually bought with my own money, because I really wanted to play Afterburner at home, even knowing that the experience probably wouldn't be up to much. But yeah, so this is the box. It comes in this interesting sort of horizontal arranged box. Most ST games tended to be in vertical boxes in that arrangement, but this is a sort of wide box. It's got the artwork and the logo on the front, the Activision logo there. They went back to sort of using their old rainbow logo by this point, after using a sort of fairly classy logo towards the end point of the 8-bit era. And then there is the back of the box. Shake, rattle, roll it. So what does the blurb have to say? Afterburner, you've played the arcade smash, now experience the white-knuckled realism of a supersonic dogfight at home, using your heat-seeking missiles and laser anti-aircraft fire. Can you be Top Gun against a seething supersonic swarm? Experience brain-numbing G-forces, bones rattling with the body-jarring pitch and yaw. Scan with your radar, lock on your target, and fire. And I don't know how well you can see that, but we've got an Amiga screenshot there. We've got an Atari ST screenshot there, showing a bit of a difference between the two platforms. So the Amiga version has a few more colours, so it's got this sort of gradient sky effect here. As the Atari ST version looks pretty similar, it just doesn't have quite as many colours on screen at once. So, Afterburner TM Sega, copyright, trademarks of Sega Enterprises Limited. This game has been manufactured under license from Sega Enterprises Limited, Japan. Now, this is one silly thing I used to think back in the day, because back in 1988, I very much associated Sega with arcade games. I was just excited to have a game on my shelf that said Sega on the side of it, because I don't know, I was young and stupid. Anyway, oh yeah, let's have a look at the other sides of the box here. Shake, rattle, roll it, Afterburner, the arcade sensation of the year. Yeah, Let's have a look inside then, see what we've got. So inside the box, here we are, we've got the game on 2 discs. There was a later budget re-release that put that onto on 1 double-sided disc instead of 2 single-sided discs. We've got the mission briefing manual, which we'll take a quick look at in a moment. And we've got a couple of paper things here, so bear with me a moment while I extract these from the box for the first time in about 30 years. So we've got a very wide and quite impractical poster, which you can pop on your wall. And here we are. Win the flight of a lifetime. Fly at twice the speed of sound. The ultimate flying experience. Free competition. You can fly in Concorde, which is not a thing anymore. So let's see what it says on here. The Activision Concorde competition. Using your skill and judgment, simply tick the correct answer in the box provided. Question 1. In which country did Concorde first land? A. France. B. USA. C. Kuwait. D. United Kingdom. Or E. Belgium. 2. Who was Concorde's first pilot? Brian Trubshaw, Douglas Bader, Gary Powers, Tom Cruise, or James T. Kirk. Number 3. At what speed does Concorde break the sound barrier? 100 miles an hour, 1,860 miles per hour, 1,340 miles per hour, 2,001 miles per hour, or 134 miles per hour. Number 4. At midday you boarded a flight on Concorde from Heathrow and you've just arrived in New York and call your parents to let them know. What time is it back home? 6:30 a.m, 3:50 p.m, 12 midday, 7 a.m, or 7 p.m. And number 5. Who made the engines for the first Concorde that flew? Was it Renault, Pratt & Whitney, Boeing, Rolls-Royce, or Saab? Then complete the following sentence in less than 10 words. If I flew a Tomcat into a dogfight, I would blank. Yeah, those are actually pretty brutal questions for this. If you think of sort of typical competitions you get these days, they tend to be very easy questions that turns the competition into effectively a prize draw. Except there are certain rules about prize draws, and so they have to put questions in there to make it seem more like a competition instead of a prize draw. But those are some actually quite tricky questions there, particularly if you didn't have access to the internet, which you probably wouldn't have done in 1988. All right, before we move on, let's just have a quick look at the mission briefing, which is the manual. So we start with some loading instructions. This is a multi-platform manual, so it gives you instructions for all of the platforms. So instructions for Commodore 64 on cassette and diskette, Amstrad CPC, Sinclair ZX Spectrum, Commodore Amiga. Notice to cassette users of Afterburner. The first section of Afterburner will load into your computer memory. Cassette versions will load in stages, and you'll see a variety of flashing colours around the screen as loading occurs. You will see on-screen prompts if you need to start or stop the cassette as you guide your F-14 through the levels. Imagine that. Imagine playing Afterburner and having to fiddle around with your tape deck while you're doing that. Okay. Yeah, so most of this is just sort of controls and so on. So it tells you a little bit about how to actually fly the ship. Afterburner is not a complicated game if you've ever come across it before, so there's not a ton of instructions really needed. So you certainly don't need a quick reference listing to say that pushing left on the joystick makes you go left. But anyway, yes, and then the rest of the manual is other languages as well. We do have a list of credits here though, so that's quite interesting. So different versions of this were done by different people. So the ST version, as we said, was done by Argonaut Software, which were the people who made Starglider, and they would later go on to develop the Super FX chip for the Super NES, Star Fox, and various other things as well. The Commodore 64 version was done by Delali Software Limited with music by Adam Gilmour, a real legend of computer music. Spectrum and Amstrad version was done by Keith Burkhill, not familiar with him. ST and Amiga by Argonaut Software, as I said. MSX version by Mr. Micro and Keith Burkhill again, so he did the Spectrum version as well. Production by Stuart Hibbert, graphics by Saul Marchese and Stuart Hibbert. Test Dave Cummins and Nick Dawson, and acknowledgement Andy, Neil, Bonita, Jane, Rod, John, marketing, manufacturing and administration, finance and sales. And the player's guide was written by Stuart Hibbert, a Software Studios production. So that's nice, isn't it? Anyway, we rambled on for nearly 10 minutes without actually playing the game, so let's go play Afterburner. Okay, here we are with Afterburner from Activision and Sega and Argonaut Software. Now, the version of the game that I'm running here is the single disc budget version. It came on a single double-sided disc instead of two single-sided discs. Unfortunately, one thing that does strip out from the original release of the game is the excellent digitized music that appeared on this loading screen. I think there's a recording of it over on Atari Mania, if I remember, which they usually don't when I say if I remember, but if I remember, I'll try and insert that soundtrack into the background here, because this is quite a long loading break. And it is a pretty magnificent piece of music in that distinct digital music 1988 tradition. I thought this game came with the cassette of the music, but I think I was thinking of something else. So some of the other stuff that Argonaut Software works on came with a cassette of the music. Starglider 2 had a cassette. Carrier Command wasn't developed by Argonaut Software, but it was published by the same people who published Starglider, I think, which was Telecom Soft. And that also came with a music cassette as well, so that was quite a popular thing back in the day. Anyway, here we are with Afterburner for Atari ST. As you'll see, it's doing its very best to do a recreation of the arcade introduction screens, just not at quite as slick a frame rate as you would have seen in the original arcade, sadly. But you know, it's a valiant effort. Red for Rinrub. Alright, let's hit the fire button and begin. Music on, sound effects on, and we'll play with joystick so we don't need to worry about mouse scaling. Alright, off we go. The game begins by picking a random one of the music tracks from the arcade version and playing that in sort of ST sound o vision. Not vision, but you know what I mean. Anyway, and then we are into our flying adventure. So, Afterburner, if you've not come across it before, your aim is simply to shoot down as many enemy planes as possible. And the way you do that is by using a combination of your guns, which in this case shoot out automatically in front of you. In the original arcade version, you had a separate button for the guns, but since the Atari ST only has a single fire button, they put the guns firing automatically in this one, and then you just press fire to launch a missile. And missiles, weirdly, you don't actually see flying out. I can't remember if that was the case in the original arcade version, but certainly in this one, you don't see missiles firing out the front of your craft. You just sort of have to look for the lock-on indicator that's down at the bottom of the screen, and the sort of lock-on sights that appear in the distance. The sort of white crosshairs that appear. And you'll see around the edge of the screen, we've got a sort of simulation. Oops. We've got a simulation of the actual sort of hardware parts of the arcade cabinet. So in the original arcade version, the lock-on lights down at the bottom, as well as the two lights at the top of the screen, which indicate when there's enemies coming from behind you, those were parts of the cabinet. Whether it was a stand-up version of Afterburner or the Fancy Pants hydraulic version, which is the main version everyone wanted to play, for obvious reasons. Now, as an adaptation of Afterburner, this actually isn't too bad. I mean, obviously the frame rate is pretty atrocious at times, particularly when there's a lot going on screen. And the way the digitized speech completely interrupts the music, as do the sound effects, is a bit of a shame. But in terms of sort of core gameplay, it's actually a reasonably accurate adaptation. And to be honest, Afterburner is cool. It's always been one of the coolest arcade games from Sega's Superscaler period. But you know, that article from the One magazine actually kind of had a point, because Afterburner is not a very deep game. And the fact it's 3D is mostly a matter of showing off rather than really adding to the gameplay as such. Because it's actually rather difficult to aim properly in this game. It's quite difficult to avoid things. And certain things just don't make sense. Like, it doesn't really make sense that double tapping a direction to do a roll like that would shake a missile off your tail and that sort of thing. And like I said, firing missiles seems to mostly be a matter of luck as to whether or not they're actually going to hit anything. Because you don't see them. You don't see if you're sort of aiming properly or not. Oops. And then sometimes you get into situations like that where you just die repeatedly. And I was sort of aware of all these things back when I originally played Afterburner, both on the Atari ST and on the rare occasions when I had the chance to play the arcade version. But I still loved it, because, again, as that article in the One magazine said, arcade games had become amusement park rides at that point. It was as much about the complete experience of enjoying that game as it was actually playing the game itself. In the case of stuff like Afterburner, the core experience was sitting in that virtual cockpit, grabbing onto the joystick and being able to slam the throttle control forward and press the Afterburner button and feel the whole thing shaking around you and tipping and pitching and rolling and all that sort of thing. That was one of the main reasons that Afterburner existed. Because at that point in history, arcade games had to do something to distinguish themselves from what was going on in the home at the time. Because home computers and video game consoles were starting to play host to increasingly complex games that were designed to be played for more than a couple of minutes at a time. And thus the arcades needed something unique. They needed a hook that they could bring people in that would convince people that it was worthwhile them spending 50p, a pound, whatever it was, in your neck of the woods to play something like Afterburner. And so when you saw an Afterburner machine, it was designed to be impressive and visually imposing and that sort of thing. You'd see this massive cabinet with this lovely artwork on the side, and you'd hear it from a mile off, and if there was someone in it playing before you, you'd see it tipping around and throwing them around and them having a lovely time and all that sort of thing. But you know, sit down and actually play the game. The game's not great. For my money, the follow-up to Afterburner, which is G-Lock, it was actually much better than Afterburner in terms of gameplay. It felt much more like actually engaging in combat. It still wasn't a sim by any means. It was still very much an arcade flying game. But it just felt a little bit more realistic. Yeah, it just felt a little bit more realistic, and you felt a bit more in control of what was actually happening. Whoops. But the home ports of G-Lock were considerably worse than this. At least partly because G-Lock came out quite a bit later, and was thus running on even more advanced hardware than Afterburner was. And at the time, the home computers, even the consoles, really were not up to doing a good port of G-Lock. And so that was one that really did remain confined to the arcades for up until very recently, actually. Like, the only time there's been a good port of G-Lock has been the Sega 80s version for Nintendo Switch, which is fantastic, by the way, if you've never played it, because not only does it have arcade perfect G-Lock in it, it also has a simulation of the hydraulic cabinet. So a bit like this game has got that sort of board around the outside that's kind of simulating the arcade cabinet.
Sega Ages G-Lock actually has a proper polygonal arcade cabinet that you sort of quote unquote sit in while you're playing, and it tilts from side to side on the screen. And if you're playing on a nice big TV or even in handheld mode on Nintendo Switch, it gives a really nice feeling of movement. I just hated this level. Just because you sort of snap back into the left side of the canyon when you let go of the joystick, and that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense because it just means you end up slamming into the wall if you're not pushing any direction. But anyway, yeah, G-Lock is a better Afterburner than Afterburner is, but I mean, this Afterburner Climax is another matter, mind you. If you get the opportunity to play Afterburner Climax on Xbox 360 or PlayStation 3, which I suspect you probably won't because it's been delisted due to, presumably, due to Sega's licensing with whoever makes the Tomcat. Is it Lockheed? Yeah, their license expired, so they weren't allowed to sell it anymore because it's got a licensed aircraft in it, which is stupid, really. But you know how it is. You know how it is these days. But yeah, Afterburner Climax is one of the great casualties of the digital age. And sadly, it's one that we probably won't see resurrected by one of the limited press houses either, because they're not going to shell out for a Tomcat license. I mean, it would be lovely. I would love a box copy of Afterburner Climax for Switch or PS4 or something like that, but no one's going to pay up for that. Now, you see that sort of missile sneaking up behind you there. This is the stage where those missiles start showing up and you have to do the double tap on the joystick to evade them. Otherwise they just go right up your ass like that. And you have very little time to respond to them either. That's partly what the red lights are for, but the trouble is the red lights don't distinguish between enemies behind you and missiles trying to insert themselves up your bot, so... But anyway, as I say, I liked playing this back in the day, even though I recognise that Afterburner wasn't an amazing game, even though I knew that this was not a patch on the arcade version by any means. It was what we had. And, you know, that was enough. That was enough at the time. Now, I will say, if you want a better home version of something that is like Afterburner, that is not actually Afterburner, I highly recommend trying out Blue Lightning on the Atari Lynx. Because that's really good. That actually fixes a lot of the issues I have with Afterburner in terms of the way it controls and that sort of thing. I think it certainly looks a lot nicer than this Atari ST port. There's much more detail on the ground, it moves more smoothly, there's a much better sense of altitude. You can notice in this one, when you pull up, you don't actually get any higher, you just sort of move up the screen a bit. Whereas in Blue Lightning, there's actually a proper sense of flying in 3D space. So like you can pull up and you'll go into the clouds, or you can pull down and you'll fly just across the ground, and you need to do both of those things in order to engage in dogfights and all that sort of thing. Why are there no enemies appearing? It's alright, I didn't want to fight any of you anyway. I didn't shoot anything down in that level. But yeah, Blue Lightning is a really good sort of arcade combat game from a similar period to this. I think it was slightly later than Afterburner, but it was certainly a similar sort of era. And rather conveniently, you can actually still play Blue Lightning today legally without having to go through dodgy emulators or dodgy ROM sites or anything like that, because it's on the second Lynx collection cartridge for the Evercade. Which is one of my favourite carts for the system because it's got all the old Epix classics for the system on it. So as well as Blue Lightning, you've also got Electro Cop, you've got California Games, you've got Gates of Zendikon, Zalo Mercenary. Yeah, there's some absolutely great games on that cartridge, and Blue Lightning is one of my favourites, I think. Can't remember how many stages this has in total. It must be a fair old distance through the game by now. You'll notice that this game follows the sort of a weird trend that Sega had in this specific moment in history, which is that your score went up at a ridiculous speed. And so within a matter of moments of starting this game, you've got several 100,000 points quickly going into the millions. And this was very much a distinctively Sega thing at that time, because Outrun does it as well. I'm not 100% sure why they chose to do that, but I guess it's just the sort of assumption that people are going to feel more inherently satisfied by massive scores than they are by smaller ones. Perhaps there was an element of showing off hardware as well. It's like, look how many digits our score counters can handle. Because not so much in the 16-bit era, but back in the 8-bit era in particular, there was very much... That was very much something worth bragging about. So our computer can count higher than 65,535, don't you know? Therefore, it's better than yours. It's all to do with sort of how many bits and bytes they can address at once and that sort of thing, and all sort of technical side of things that we just don't even think about when it comes to computers these days. It's just not a thing anymore, because we just assume that our computers can do pretty much anything, and they can, so... Which in some ways is cool, but in other ways is very boring. See, I still look on stuff like this quite fondly, even with its obvious limitations, and even with its obvious things that you can criticise it for, because it's a period where every platform was unique. Every platform had its own distinct look and feel to it. Like we saw when we looked at the manual, Afterburner came out on the Commodore 64, it came out on the Spectrum, came out on the Amstrad, came out on the Amiga. Every single one of those versions would have felt very different. Some of them would have probably been complete garbage. I mean, some of you may think that this version is complete garbage, but, you know, when you consider what this probably looked like in a Spectrum. Still, that was what went on at the time. And while at the time it might have been a bit frustrating to have one of the quote-unquote inferior systems, looking back on all that today, it's really fascinating to see the different platforms and how they handled stuff that was obviously beyond its capabilities. So looking at arcade conversions on the Spectrum is really interesting, actually, because the Spectrum was so underpowered when it came to graphics and sound that certain compromises had to be made, but in some cases that actually resulted in really interesting things happening. Like a long time ago on this series we looked at the Atari ST version of Stunrunner, which was okay, but ran at a terrible frame rate and wasn't entirely true to the arcade version. Spectrum version, because the Spectrum wasn't really up to pushing that many polygons around the screen at once, they did something completely different for the graphics, and it actually ended up working out quite well for that version of the game. Yeah, this time we have to keep tapping left instead of tapping right, so it's different. I believe you can also crash into trees in this one just to make things even more awkward. Oh no, there we go. No! Oh, bollocks. I was going so well up until that point as well. Until we get to the uncontrollable canyon stage. Because yes, in Afterburner you have lives rather than G-Dock's time system. To get the top score though, 227 hits with a score of 12,310,070 points. I will assign that to Pete. And I got all of those medals because I'm great. We must have been pretty near the end of the game there. But sadly it was not to be. Anyway, that was Afterburner for Atari ST, a game I have some fond memories of. Probably not going to return to this version too often, because I have Afterburner Climax, I have the Nintendo Switch version of G-Dock, I have Blue Lightning. There are much better ways to enjoy Afterburner these days, but this is how I enjoyed Afterburner back in the day. And thus it's always going to have a certain amount of being special to me, in a strange sort of way. Even in the knowledge that it was sort of a bit in a lot of ways. But anyway, there we go. That is what we had to live through. As always, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you again next time.